Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Faith Matters podcast. I'm Patrick Mason. I'm not your usual host, but I'm really happy to be here for this special episode with Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. Laurel, we're thrilled to have you here.
Well, I'm delighted to be here with you.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
So this conversation is part of a series on plural marriage that Faith Matters is going to be sponsoring. And we're going to be talking about some of the history behind it. And I assume that most listeners will know who Laurel is, but just by way of brief introduction, Laurel is one of the premier historians of early America, especially of women's experiences in early America, the author of lots of different books, won the Pulitzer Prize for A Midwife's Tale that was turned into a PBS documentary, won a MacArthur Genius Grant, taught for many, many years at Harvard, and then retired a few years ago.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
But we're going to be especially talking about, there's so much to talk about there, but we're just going to focus on Mormonism.
Okay.
And especially your book, A House Full of Females, which you have a copy of here.
Yeah.
You could show everybody.
Okay.
Right? So A House Full of Females, Plural Marriage and Women's Rights in Early Mormonism. So we're going to talk about some of that and then talk about what we know about Joseph Smith and the origins of plural marriage and then how it developed into Utah.
Okay.
Okay? So Laurel, how do we know what we know about polygamy? And I ask that because there have long time been people who questioned whether or not Joseph Smith was even involved in plural marriage at all, right? But in the 19th century, the reorganized church, that was one of its founding principles. Today, in the 21st century, there are a number of people who cast doubt on whether we even know that Joseph Smith practiced at all. So can you talk a little bit about, like, in some ways, this is a question about like what historians do and how historians know what we know.
Yes, a great question. I mean, we only know what happened in the past from surviving sources. And it's amazing, particularly when we're talking about polygamy. Most of the sources were created by men. And polygamy is about relationships between men and women. So one of the real challenges is to get to the voices. And also, so many of the sources on any topic tend to be the ones that survive and are accessible are official in some way. So getting to private experience, and nothing is more private than the household and marriage, can be really difficult. And then the third problem, polygamy was very controversial.
Yeah.
And so who's biased? Who's not biased? When was it written? Who wrote it? What were they up to? What did they want to convey? Who did they want to persuade? So it's kind of a nest of tangled problems to try to go through the sources and come to terms. Now, we also know from people's memories, I know there was polygamy because I know that my mother was, even though I had handcart pioneers, my mother was a convert to the church because her grandmother refused to have baptized her father, my grandfather, who was never a member of the church because she was so annoyed that her husband had taken a second wife. And my mother knew all the cousins. She knew her grandmother. She knew the cousins who had come, who were members and who were not members. And so we also learned from retrospective accounts and from the memories people carry. And every one of those sources requires really careful analysis. And historians spend a lot of time shop talk. You know, how do we know this? How do we know that?
Yeah.
But there's universal evidence that Latter-day Saints up to the very early 20th century, actually, were actively performing marriages of a man to more than one woman. And it was a national scandal. So we also have all those sources, and there were laws past Supreme Court decision
Right.
full of all kinds of information about what was happening. And we don't have as many sources for Joseph Smith.
Yeah, that's going to be my question, because nobody
Yeah.
doubts that Brigham Young practiced
No,
it.
no,
It was
no,
out
no,
in the
no.
open. But so how do we know that Joseph Smith practiced it? It was
Right.
clandestine, it was secret, it was in private.
Right. It was kept secret, but not forever. And so most of the sources that document who was married to Joseph, who was sealed or married, whatever that was, emerged later. There were affidavits taken, for example, legal affidavits taken when the reorganized church was contesting the notion that Joseph Smith had ever been a polygamist. So there were affidavits taken, but in the period of Joseph Smith's life, there are lots of rumors, lots of conflict that produce documents, and it's detective work. It is very interesting, and we have to decide who is credible, who is not credible. It seems to me there's really, well, I have to be careful because there are people whose faith may depend on Joseph Smith not practicing polygamy. I will say my understanding of the evidence says it's overwhelming that he introduced the concept of plurality or plural marriage, taking it out of the Old Testament as validation, and was it polygamy?
So that's a good question. I mean, even
Yeah.
about some of the terms. So even as we've been talking, we've used
Yeah.
different terms. We talk about polygamy, we talk about plural marriage.
Yes.
I mean, there are even more specific terms like polygyny or a polyandry.
Right.
So can we just do a little bit of definitional work?
Well, I'm going to rely on Kathy Danes because I think I really admire her work. And she's a historian who's done a lot of statistical analysis of how plural marriage was practiced in Utah, but she also has done work on the origins of plural marriage. And she says what was happening in Nauvoo was proto-polygamy. And it was a kind of experimental effort to introduce as a restoration of an Old Testament practice. You know, Joseph Smith talked about a restoration of all things.
Right.
And this had to be restored. I mean, Eliza Snow uses that argument later. We thought, got to be restored. And God wants us to do it now. But to be a marriage, you need a documentation, you need consummation, sexual intercourse. It's usually cohabitation, merging of economic resources. And there was no record of the earliest. There were records toward the end of the Nauvoo period, particularly after Joseph Smith's death, but didn't write it down. There may be a couple of entries in William Clayton's diary where he mentions an actual performance of a marriage, but it would not have been a
legal records.
marriage.
Yeah.
It was not a temple marriage. There wasn't a temple. And then no cohabitation. Joseph lived with his wife, Emma, and there are plenty of claims that some people who did live in the house as servants may have entered into this relationship. But most of them didn't, and some of them actually were married to other men. And the consummation is the tricky point, because later, in the period when there was this conflict between the reorganization and the Brigham Young, the Brighamites, there were some testimony given in a lawsuit where at least one of these women talked about, well, of course, But how do we know?
Right.
So that's where we are. But there's no question about the concept
Yes.
coming from Joseph Smith.
And there are some contemporaneous sources like William Clayton's diary and so forth that do point to. So it's not only retrospective evidence.
No, it isn't, because the 132nd section of the Doctrine and Covenants was, as was common for Joseph Smith, was dictated, it was kind of complicated, the way they set it up. God dictated to Joseph Smith, who dictated to William Clayton, who wrote it down. And that is a verified document of having coming from Nauvoo.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about this. I mean, I'm fascinated. You taught a course on polygamy at Harvard.
Yes.
But not just Mormon polygamy.
No.
It was more comparative.
Yes.
I'll bet people would just be fascinated to know, like, what was that class like, or what were those conversations like? And for you especially, we want to get back, of course, to Joseph Smith and these other things. But what were the big takeaways for you?
Yeah.
Because you had done all this work studying Mormon polygamy or plural marriage. What are the big takeaways when you put it in a broader historical and cultural context?
It was great fun, for one thing. And I did it, I think it was my last year teaching at Harvard. It was sort of, what the heck? I'm going to try this. And it was a seminar. I think we had, it was probably about 12 students, and they were a mixture of advanced undergraduates and graduates, including some from the Harvard Divinity School, because I wanted that input as well. I think there was one Latter-day Saint student in that class, but they were a real mix of students. And I called the course Polygamy Debates. I actually spent a fair amount of time in my teaching in general trying to contextualize in the 19th century the controversy over polygamy. So that's one polygamy debate. But what was fun for me about this course was being able to work with documents going back to the 15th century. We had a great anthology that had been published, and there's so many amazing books and primary documents. Polygamy has always been there, and it's always been controversial, and there have always been debates and attacks. The takeaway points are really crucial, that polygamy is shaped by intense divisions over cultural difference and religious difference, just as it was in the 19th century about Mormonism. But technically, I mean, it goes back to the Old Testament. I mean, what happens to the story about Abraham, who is the model for Joseph Smith? Well, the rule of Sarah says that Sarah gives Hagar to his wife. What happens to Hagar?
She gets driven out eventually.
She's gone.
Yeah.
Where are we today, right now? We're in a cataclysmic war between the descendants, figuratively, between Sarah and Hagar. And it was a division between Europeans and Muslims. It was a division within Judaism. There were divisions in the discovery of the New World, in the realm of exploration and settlement of the American continent. I mean, and Africa, look at all these strange people. It's the savage people who practice polygamy, and we are Europeans. We are above it. So there's no talking about polygamy without talking about war, conflict, race, and of course, it's all about gender. So it's the perfect historical document to talk about today. One final point. I love this. And it just, some of the students were blown away by it. Because we're in a debate over marriage today. All kinds of debates over forms of marriage. And the hot topic in the Restoration was divorce. And there's this great document, I didn't have time to look it up so I can explicitly quote, but Martin Luther thought polygamy would have been a far better solution for Henry rather than divorce or maybe execution of the wife. You know,
from a straight biblical perspective, right, there's polygamy all over the place, but Jesus clearly condemns divorce.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Yeah.
So it was the divorce, polygamy, and polygamy looked better.
Yeah.
And there were writers in 18th century England who thought polygamy would be a much better solution than all these brothels.
Right. Well, and that's part of the argument that Orson Pratt will eventually make in 1852.
And that's an old argument by the time Orson Pratt makes it.
That's fascinating.
So it's a big issue. And the wonderful moment in the course was when a visiting scholar at the Divinity School who's descended from the Blackfeet came to class, and she and I shared stories about our polygamous ancestors.
Right. Oh, that's fascinating. Okay, well, let's zero in on Latter-day Saint plural marriage.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the Blackfeet and everybody else, but let's zero in on this. Of course, in recent years, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the history department, has published all these essays, these gospel topics essays. And there are a series of these about plural marriage, its origins, its practice, and eventually its end. I want to read a paragraph from the gospel topics essay about plural marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo, and then get your reaction to it in terms of how we think about this. It says, and it's talking about Joseph Smith's practice of plural marriage. The exact number of women to whom he was sealed in his lifetime is unknown because the evidence is fragmentary. Some of the women who were sealed to Joseph Smith later testified that their marriages were for time and eternity, while others indicated that their relationships were for eternity alone. Most of those sealed to Joseph Smith were between 20 and 40 years of age, and at the time of their sealing to him. The oldest, Fanny Young, was 56 years old. The youngest was Helen Mar Kimball, the daughter of Joseph's close friends Heber C. and Violet Marie Kimball, who was sealed to Joseph Smith several months before her 15th birthday. I don't know why they didn't just say she was 14.
Yeah.
So what do you make of that? Does that seem to capture kind of what we know about Joseph Smith's practice of plural marriage?
Well, it's a bit frustrating because when I was working on my book, there were so many estimates and such contradictory evidence. I kept waiting for the Joseph Smith Papers Project to give us a list so we knew who. And
because other historians have published books where they've done that.
Oh,
where
yes,
they've published
absolutely.
books.
And I wanted the church history department to get it all tied up in a bow. And in fact, they promised to do that in the preface of one of the many, many volumes. Yeah. And then, lo and behold, they said, well, we did, but we can't decide.
Yeah. The evidence it's too hard.
That's how confusing it really is. But the confusion is not over whether Joseph Smith was associated through some sealing ritual with these women, but what did that mean? Well, it's the proto-polygamy that makes it so darn complicated. The interesting thing for me in working on a house full of females, I worked with diaries. So I focused on Wilford Woodruff's wonderful diary and several other men, but I located on a group of women who later were very powerful in the Relief Society and in leadership. And quite a few of those were, quote, sealed to Joseph Smith. It was very important to them. They considered it, they had a kind of relationship with each other. But what do you do when you've been sealed to somebody who dies? And the church came up with the great idea that other men would marry them in polygamy. And Brigham Young, for example, Zina Huntington, becomes the wife of Brigham Young.
Eliza Snow.
And Eliza Snow. And eventually there's a whole house full, the Lion House in Utah, and some of those women have been sealed to Joseph Smith. And so according to the theology, they would not be with Brigham Young, but they would be in a household. And what's really fascinating about it, a couple of them at least, Zina and her sister, had children by Brigham Young, but they were told in heaven they would belong to Joseph Smith. So that's how complicated and wild this story begins.
Especially because of this proto-polygamy where there's no rules yet.
No, there's no rule.
I mean, after 1852, after it's public, it becomes a system.
And that's right. And let me just say something about that.
Yeah.
They tried to keep it secret even in winter quarters and as they're crossing across the plain. So it's announced by Brigham Young at a big meeting in the tabernacle where they read the section that becomes section 132. It wasn't in the Doctrine and Covenants yet, but they read it, they announce it, they say it's wonderful, and now we're going to call 100 men to go out and preach it to the world, to save the world from degradation and to tell them the true gospel. So I like the fact that Brigham Young was upfront. He wasn't going to hide.
Yeah. Okay, just to put a point on it, so you've mentioned this earlier, but do we know for sure, one way or the other, whether Joseph Smith had sex with some of the women that he was sealed to? And were there any children from those relationships?
Okay, we don't know whether he had sex. We do know he didn't have children. Or let me put it this way. No one has claimed, and I think this is important because how important would you be in a pro-polygamy society where the most powerful men have multiple wives? It would be really great to claim you were a child of Joseph Smith. It would be pretty special. Any claims that have merged, usually from their descendants, have failed when put to the DNA tests. There are cases where they can't find a descendant and get the DNA evidence. But so I'll put it very, very carefully. There is no evidence that there were any children.
There were some claims later on, a handful of claims. There were some claims,
but they were late claims.
Yeah. Do we know, did he consummate some of those marriages even if they did not, or some of those sealings even if they did not?
Well, we don't know, but we know that there were a couple who claimed. I don't know how, I can't remember how many. One is, I remember for sure, claimed in a testimony in the so-called Temple Lot case, I think. So
again, so some of these women claim that about themselves, right? That they had been sealed to Joseph, and that it was a full marriage for time and eternity, not just eternity.
Yeah, exactly.
What about polyandry? This idea of multiple men being married to a woman. So this is where Joseph did approach, on some occasions, a woman who was already married to another man, and then was sealed to her.
He did that surprisingly fairly often. I mean, there's Sarah Kimball, who's such an important leader in the women's movement in the late 19th century. But she tells the story that Joseph Smith tried to teach her about polygamy, and she told him to teach it to somebody else. But she was married, and she was married to a man at the time who was not a member of the church. He later became a member of the church. But the women, it's confusing. Zina is a pretty powerful example, and Marty Bradley, and others have written a lot about Zina. She's an important person in my book because
Zina, the last name, the Huntington, Jacobs.
Yeah, and she was married, but the story is told that Joseph didn't want her to marry and felt he had claimed her. And she was sealed to him. And it's a long, complicated story, but Joseph dies and she chooses Brigham over the young man that she had married. She had several children by him, and that goes on for many months, years actually, would they reconcile. But she chose to live in plural marriage with Brigham Young. And then my favorite actually is Patty Sessions. And Patty Sessions, her husband was a member, they go west and so on. I don't know the exact circumstances, but her husband dies on the way in Utah eventually. And her sealing is mysterious. She's the witness that it happened, which reinforces the notion of proto-polygamy.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, I want to be with you in the hereafter kind of thing. But what I love is her true husband, her actual husband, the father of all of her children, who drives her crazy, and she's terrified he was going to take another wife, and he does, and then he dies, and she has to kind of support and take care of the new wife and her children. And eventually, Patty marries somebody again, so she's a widow, she remarries, and she writes in her diary, "Brother so-and-so and I were married yesterday. Thank goodness I have someone to cut my wood."
That's what it's all about.
I think, we forget.
Yeah.
This is an economic partnership in a marriage is maybe even primarily economic.
Throughout history, for sure. Yeah.
Throughout history. And romantic love is pretty new. Romantic love is not new. It's been there all along, but romantic love that leads to marriage is very new. It really
That's the primary driving force.
Late 18th century and still somewhat suspect, into the 19th century. And sex is meant to be controlled and contained and is primarily for reproduction according to lots of people. Other people think it's important and should be expressed. So there's no general consensus on any of these things. And in terms of sexual relationships within polygamy, I found a little evidence. I think it was interesting and worth presenting that really many women were quite happy not to be pregnant all the time.
Right.
And it is clearly demonstrated that although plural marriage, males have far more children than they would in monogamy, women have fewer. And so concern for wives, concern for intercourse during pregnancy or even lactation, there's a lot of restrictions on sexual activity in marriage. At the same time, there's an assumption that women are to be subject to men and men have a stronger sexual drive. And that plays a part, those common assumptions in the way people react and in the way they practice plurality.
Yeah.
And, they don't tell us. People don't write about their sex lives.
Right.
Yeah.
So
some of them do, but not very many.
Right. So let's talk about some of the ideas behind this, some of the theology and the ideas behind it that's driving, because with these different kinds of relationships, the polyandry and so forth, I mean, what do you think, and I want to talk about the revelation that becomes section 132 in just a moment, but it's like, what is, in your sense, what is going on, especially in Nauvoo, that the theology will formalize later on, but especially in Kirtland and Nauvoo, what do you think is going on? We can't read Joseph Smith's mind, but as far as we can tell from the sources we have, either in his mind or in the people that he introduces it to, what is the theological system or idea that's going on here?
Well, I think it's restoration.
Yeah.
I think that's really important, but I also think it's Jesus is coming. And we're in a hurry.
So we have to restore everything fast.
We have to do it fast.
Yeah.
And
I think sometimes we underestimate just how imminent they believe the second coming was.
Oh, yes.
Right? It's the one doctrine, I always say, like, it's literally the one doctrine that's built into the name of the church. Right? It's the Church of Jesus Christ, a Latter-day Saints. It's not the Church of Jesus Christ of tithing saints or word of wisdom saints. It's Latter-day, this idea that Jesus is coming.
He is coming. And we didn't get the temple built in Jackson County.
Yeah.
And the people who live through those experiences, and then I think Taylor Petrie's wonderful dialogue article on the sealings of different, not marital sealings, but sealings at priesthood.
Sometimes even men to men.
And men to men and sons to daughters. And on the journey west, they had the 12 apostles being the leaders of different companies. And it's a kind of recapturing of ancient Israel, but primarily what it becomes, and it's hard to know, but I've been rereading the 132nd section as well and some of the other material, and there's this sense of Abrahamic promise of your descendants will be as the sands of the sea. It's not just immediately how many babies you have, but those babies are going to have babies.
Right.
And you're going to be gods with this amazing kingdom by obeying God. And we don't think about that. Maybe we will later, but I was just kind of talking to my sister. I mean, when I was pregnant with my 5th child, I was insulted by somebody. I was increasing the population of the earth, and that wasn't appropriate,
Right.
And now we've got people saying, oh, collapse.
Right.
Who's going to pay for the Social Security if we don't have more kids? I mean, but that sense of is powerful, particularly in a society where so many people die.
Yeah.
And die young.
Yeah.
And it appears that Alvin's death was considered kind of catastrophic in the Smith family.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about section 132, or the revelation that becomes section 132. I'll start at the meta level, and then we'll drill into some of the particulars.
Yeah.
How do you, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, read this revelation? It's highly legalistic in a sense, that it's deeply rooted in this biblical narrative. In another sense, there's all this language of threat, especially towards Emma, towards the end. So just at a kind of meta level, how do you make sense of this document?
I can't make sense of it as a coherent revelation from God. I can make sense of parts of it, but it feels unstable. Like it begins with the very profound and important principle that things can be bound in earth and be legal, but that doesn't mean they're going to be bound in heaven. But then it kind of meanders, and it doesn't really confront plural marriage very explicitly until it gets to the problems. And it almost feels like the problems are Well, they are. You don't have to imagine they're real. They are immediately issues in Joseph Smith's own life. So it goes from the kind of cosmic level down to this, please God, tell me what I got to do. I'm going to read out Emma, or
Yeah.
and I read it actually as, I gave a talk once in which a man came up to me. I wrote it down so I could remember, because it was so clever, and unfortunately I didn't remember the man's name. But he said there were 3 ways to think about polygamy in Joseph Smith. Number 1, God told Joseph Smith to practice polygamy. Number 2, Joseph Smith thought God wanted him to practice polygamy. Number 3, God let Joseph Smith practice polygamy. You could add a number 4, God had nothing to do with it.
Right. Joseph just decided to do it. Yeah.
And so the whole polygamy thing can really be a crisis of faith.
Yeah.
Depending on how you approach it, I think.
Do you think, so, Section 132, it's about plural marriage, but it also is the main text that Latter-day Saints still use to teach the doctrine of sealing. And so
Sealing,
now
yes.
celestial marriage is no longer plural marriage. It's basically just marriage in the celestial kingdom.
And
You need
it's
eternal marriage.
a priesthood authority that makes something go into the hereafter.
Right. So can you, historically, and this is where history and theology collide,
Yes,
right?
they really do.
But can we disentangle these two? So, Latter-day Saints obviously want to hold on to this concept of sealing, right?
Of
It's
course.
at the foundation.
That's very
right?
important.
Can you disentangle that from plurality, or are the two so mixed up?
I think a really inspired, clever person could, because in some ways there are some brilliant people, who can do this, but there's a turning point. There are a couple of turning points in the section, and it felt to me that when we start talking about the Old Testament prophets who had more than one wife, we sort of shift topics right there. And that's when it starts getting into adultery and Sarah doing what God wants her to do. And that's a problem, because the Old Testament pattern is so important in Joseph Smith's thinking. But it would be a brave person. Well, it would be an inspired prophet who would revise that. There's a lot of precedent, because that wasn't in the Doctrine and Covenants until the 1870s, I think.
Yeah, the original Doctrine and Covenants did have a section on marriage, but it was a very clear statement on monogamous marriage.
Absolutely,
Right?
and the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
And so there could be a reconciliation, I think, if there was someone who had the courage as well as the inspiration to do that and see why it matters.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk for a little bit about Emma Smith and her role in the Revelation itself, but then outside of the Revelation as well. So I want to read just a couple of verses from the Revelation. This is section 132, verse 41, and then verses 51 and 52, and just get your response to this. So this is verse 41. And as ye have asked concerning adultery, verily, verily, I say unto you, if a man receiveth a wife in the new and everlasting covenant, and if she be with another man, and I have not appointed unto her by the holy anointing, she hath committed adultery and shall be destroyed. So women don't have this other option like men do.
They can't have two spouses.
And then in verse 51 and 52, specifically about Emma, verily I say unto you, a commandment I give unto mine handmaid Emma Smith, your wife, whom I've given unto you, Joseph Smith, that she stay herself and partake not of that which I commanded you to offer unto her. For I did it, saith the Lord, to prove you all as I did Abraham, and that I might require an offering at your hand by covenant and sacrifice. And let mine handmaid Emma Smith receive all those that have been given unto my servant Joseph, and who are virtuous and pure before me, and those who are not pure and have said they were pure shall be destroyed, saith the Lord God. And there's more. So how do you...
There is more. Well, I mean, here's where we maybe go to William Clayton. I think Joseph appeared to be jealous at one point about Emma. I mean, he's quizzing Clayton, as I recall, about
whether she is entertaining some other options, right?
Yeah, and so it could be that. There's so much going on, and I'm thrilled to know that the Clayton Diaries are going to be published. It's an amazing document, but it's probably the only document that gives us any glimpse into Joseph Smith and polygamy. I mean, it's the best source, and it's been lifted out and published in various places, some of it in a house full of females. And it sees a kind of ugly side, actually.
Do you
Very
think
much, I'm right.
Yeah. Do you think Emma is either threatening that if Joseph can do this, she can too?
I actually think the more logical assumption, but she could be threatening. I mean, that's possible. She's angry enough. If you're going to do this, I'm going to do this.
Right.
But it also could be, I'm going to divorce you.
Right.
And she absolutely could have done it and probably succeeded because Illinois had a liberal divorce. You had to prove grounds. You also had to prove that you had been faithful. So it's hard, but the majority of divorces were given to women in Illinois. Abraham Lincoln had a big divorce practice, actually.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
And anyway, that would have not been good for him.
For Joseph,
because he would have been probably, she'd have had to charge infidelity.
Right. And this is in the wake of the John Bennett scandals around spiritual wifery.
I think that was a more plausible threat. However, Emma did remarry rather quickly, to the shock of nearly everybody.
Yeah.
So it was a horrible, miserable time. And then Joseph was killed. I think there's a reconciliation, and I think Emma, this is me thinking, interpreting the documents, but I think it highly likely he does stop taking wives.
Right.
And they introduce the endowment in the covenanted circle, and there aren't any plural wives.
Yeah.
And Emma is the partner in introducing those rituals. So that could explain her insistence that Joseph was not a polygamist.
So that's what I want to talk about next.
Yeah,
so I mean, on her, we have this incredible interview that, now of course we know that she doesn't go west with Brigham Young, in part because of polygamy. There's lots of issues.
The whole economic mess.
Right, exactly. The family finances, and there's a quarrel over leadership and so forth. But part of it is around polygamy.
Yeah.
And then of course that we know that becomes a pillar of the reorganization, which her son Joseph Smith III will eventually lead. And she's about to die, and he sits down for a long interview with her. It's one of the great sources of early Mormonism, right? Is this interview of Joseph Smith III and Emma Smith. And this is in 1879. It's published in the Saints Herald, which is the reorganized newspaper, in 1879. And she says this, a series of statements. There was no revelation on either polygamy or spiritual wives. No such thing as polygamy or spiritual wifery was taught publicly or privately before my husband's death that I have now or ever had any knowledge of. He had no other wife but me. He did not have improper relations with any woman that came to my knowledge. I know he had no other wife or wives than myself in any sense, either spiritual or otherwise. How do you make sense of that interview?
Well, she's old.
Okay.
But in some ways, what's she trying to do here? If that moment of reconciliation and the beginning of the endowment really did represent him bowing to her in some way, she could say he repented.
So that's interesting. So I've always thought of this as a kind of trauma-born denial.
Yeah, it could be.
But that's in the sense that maybe she thinks that he really did renounce it in the last several months of his life. Actually, it looks like their marriage in the last, say, 6 months of his life is fairly warm.
Yeah.
They seem reconciled to
Right.
one another.
Right.
We don't have records of him taking additional pearl wives in 1844,
No.
the year of his
No.
death. And so maybe you're suggesting that she says he got that out of his system, he did it, and it was as if he never did it? Or...
Yeah, well, that's kind of what I'm saying. And I think it's a mixture of a lot of things. What really intrigues me, other women knew he did it.
Yeah.
And they were close associates of Emma.
In the Relief Society.
In the Relief Society. And I think it must have been just awful because they chose Brigham.
Yeah.
And they went west.
Yeah.
And they
She lost friends. She lost everything.
Friends,
Right?
and you know, Brigham was really hard on her, but then if she would repent,
Right.
you know, I'd bring her back at any point. And so it's heartbreaking because it was a division in the female community, and those women were not namby-pamby. I mean, they're extremely strong women, and they're the ones who testify that it did indeed happen.
Yeah.
It's tough, but you know, Emma had her second marriage was to a man who had a child by another woman, unmarried.
Yeah.
And really, maybe it's time, I mean, the long ago biography of the Linda and
Valiant Tippett Avery and Linda King Newell.
that was
Mormon
a
Enigma.
path-breaking book.
Yeah.
But maybe it's time for another generation to
revisit Emma.
and revisit Emma.
Well, you mentioned this a little bit, all of these women, right?
Yeah.
Polygamy, it's not just about the man, right?
No, it's not about the man.
And that's the title of your book, A House Full of Females. And even in Nauvoo, it's a lot of the women who are involved are all part of the founding of the Relief Society, this women's organization that's emerging. So what's the relationship of plural marriage and the Relief Society?
Well, it's complicated because Emma Smith, as president of the Relief Society, led the whole huge successful campaign to save Joseph.
Right, to root out immorality.
Against John C. Bennett.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I think Linda and Val developed that in their book, you know, this kind of sense of betrayal. And it's hard to know how to interpret that. One possibility is Emma really didn't know about those early. She certainly did when, you know, kind of later. But Relief Society, and I would contrast this with the extremely patriarchal language in the 132nd section. Like, it's all about a wife being owned by a man.
Yeah.
And
I will give you.
And it's horrible.
Yeah.
I mean, it's patriarchal to the nth degree, which is why it curls hair when we have to look at it. But his speeches to the Women Relief Society that are recorded by Eliza R. Snow and others, he's turning the key in their behalf, which is also linked to Emma and being the elect lady and being the woman who administers the endowment with him at the end. So it depends on, it's a heartbreaking rift, I think, over women.
Yeah.
And Eliza and others, I mean, they bowed to the authority rather than attacking it, but they so amazingly successfully subverted it and came out with a lot of power. And
So how do we think about this? I mean, I've heard arguments, and historians have made arguments all over the map, right?
Yeah.
In terms of like polygamy obviously is grounding in patriarchy. I mean, it's like, and not even patriarchy in the way that we sometimes throw around the term, like the dictionary definition of patriarchy, right?
Absolutely.
So there's clearly that element.
Yeah.
But then there's these elements where plural marriage can sometimes, there's a sense of women's empowerment, community. Later on, of course, in Utah, this is not part of proto-polygamy, but later on, right? It'll connect to women's suffrage. So how do you assess like the feminist in you and as a historian and
well,
then thinking
okay,
about it?
I have an answer to that, and it comes from Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Okay.
And when she traveled to Utah in 1872, 71 or 72, reporters said, "What do you think about Brigham Young and polygamy?" And of course, she thought it was horrible. But she said, "How is it different from monogamy?"
Huh.
And that's the answer. Both systems, as practiced in the 19th century and over centuries, are patriarchal.
Yeah.
She said, "Take your choice."
Pick your poison.
Yeah, pick your poison. And the assumption that our romanticized notion of marriage that sometimes happens.
Yeah.
But marriage is one of the most fraught experiences in life, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And if we look around us at heartbreak and sorrow, this is marriage.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
also the way that it empowers and
that
liberates.
empowers and it doesn't. And yeah. And I think the Latter-day Saints were inclined through experience and partly through being persecuted toward really clinging to the community in really strong ways. So the community becomes more important than any, because there are just these amazing divorces, some of which I talk about, and the women gossip about them, Phoebe Woodruff and others. You know, you could get a divorce by just walking in and saying, "I've had enough." Now, you've got to figure out how to support yourself. But Wilford, most of the general authorities went through divorces, and what they would do is go marry another polygamist.
Mm-hmm.
They liked those women better. I don't know. I'm just being kind of goofy here. But I think part of our problem was seeing that women could flourish in a society that had plural marriage in a pretty modest way. I mean, Brigham Young and a couple of others were pretty unique. I mean, it was usually two wives.
Yeah.
But that it could flourish is not surprising, because human beings, including women, flourish in some terrible circumstances. Right. And marriage is not all that easy in the monogamous term. Yeah. Okay,
last question for you. What is the legacy of plural marriage today for Mormons and Mormonism?
What a great thing to think about. I'll tell you a little story. I don't want to. I studied at the University of Utah, and I had the amazing experience of, every semester, I signed up for an institute class, and I have no intention of ever being a historian, but I did all of Edgar Lyons classes, and it must have been a course on the Doctrine and Covenants. And I know several of us were saying, we couldn't wait till we got to the 132nd section. And we came to class, it was in sequence. We thought that was going to be the lesson. And he just turned the page over and went to the next, and went to the next. So that's one of the lessons.
Sure.
We got a kind of problem
Yeah.
right in the middle of our sacred scripture. That's a legacy.
Yeah.
And I imitated him once when I was teaching gospel doctrine, and I told that story, and I said, so we're going to turn the... But I've usually been braver. But anyway, that's a legacy. The other legacy is the ways in which the attitudes and the structures perpetuate the worst parts of plural marriage. Things about who can and cannot be sealed in heaven. Yeah. Things about ignoring the Relief Society minutes and still not taking them fully in and embracing them as a beautiful antidote to some of that patriarchalism.
Yeah.
And I don't know if, and then it comes to the crisis of faith. People are heartbroken, you know, who really feel the Spirit and then read things and learn things that, Joseph Smith is not a perfect person. You can't read the evidence and not know that he lied.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a lot of complicated legacies.
Yeah.
Well, good. Well, there's so much more we could talk about. Obviously, it is an enormously complex topic. But thank you so much for taking.
Thank you.
Thanks for your years of research and for expertise on this and for talking about this tough subject and shedding some light on it. So,
okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for listening, and we want to send a huge thanks to Patrick and Laurel for this conversation. Please note again that this episode is part of our broader 5-part series, Unpacking Polygamy, and we'd love for you to listen to the other episodes as well. And as always, if Faith Matters content is resonating with you and you get a chance, we would be incredibly grateful for a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We read all the reviews, and they definitely help get the word out about Faith Matters. Thank you again for listening, and as always, you can check out more at faithmatters.org.